Good morning, and I just want to make sure I'm going to set something up. I'm just going to share the screen for a second so that when we start this, I make sure that I've got the computer sound on. Okay. All right, so anyway, good morning. The first thing I want to do is compliment everybody who thanked me for my shirt this week, last week, sorry. So I decided that I would up my game a little bit. So I put my Christmas shirt on this week. So I expect even nicer compliments this week. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mute you guys. But you can unmute yourselves if you have a question. And at the end, I had a bit of feedback last time that I need to stay on. So I'll stay on for about 15, 20 minutes afterwards if there's anybody that has any questions. If you have a chat, if you want to ask a question, Yoeman is next door to me, and you can send her a chat directly if you want me to, if you don't want to unmute yourself and ask the question. And we're going to try and stick to the same time that we're doing today for the next, well, until the virus disappears and we're all going back to work as normal. So I appreciate any questions or feedback afterwards. So please, you've got my email address, you can see it on my screen. And I'm gradually setting up distributor meetings as well. I've done a number of them already. I'm doing about 3 or 4 of these a day, which is, it's interesting while everybody's excited about it, this new form of communication, but we'll see how long everybody's enthusiasm lasts. Next week, I've changed the topic. This week, I'm going to talk about site-specific winemaking. I thought I'd talk about this before I talked about what I want to do next week. So we've got a major big project on for us, and that we're going to be planting a new vineyard next year. It was to be this year, but because we've got the shutdown, we don't have any county employees who are doing the sign-offs on pulling vineyards. So it's had a major ramification here already. A lot of layoffs, of course, as a result, because there's no work to be done in the vineyards as far as vineyard development, which normally happens at this time of year. The reason why we have pressure is we're not allowed to remove vineyards until after April 1st, but if you don't have a permit, you can't pull the vineyard. And then secondly, you can, the way you burn the vines, you can only do that until May 1st. So if you don't have a permit to pull your vineyard, you can't get a permit to burn your vines. So it's a big catch-22 situation. So what we'll end up doing is, and I'll talk about this next week, we'll be able to pull the vineyard this year, but we won't be able to replant until 2021. This week, I'm going to talk, as I said, I'm going to talk about site-specific winemaking, and that's about Cabernet. The wines that I'm going to be, obviously the Alexander Valley is what I'm going to focus on today, not Oakville. So the Alexander Valley, just a quick reminder of the wines that we make from the Alexander Valley. Katherine, which is our big go-to wine, which has become hugely successful, keeps our lights on. So anything you can do to keep pushing that through retail at this point would be hugely beneficial. Forefathers, which is the first wine they ever made, and something that comes from a very special vineyard further north of us. And then of course Yoeman and Yoeman PLUS, and Yoeman PLUS has got the new label in it. I don't know if you guys have seen the new label, but it's the black label. So these, I'll talk a little bit about Yoeman today. And then I just want to show you guys, and I put this on Instagram for some stupid reason. I was stupid the other day. I put this up, which is the new magnums that we've just made. And suddenly we've got a whole bunch of orders and people complaining that they can't get them. So if you are interested in magnums, then please go ahead and reach out for us directly. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start this. It always does this, man. So I'm going to talk, as I said, about Alexander Valley with Cabernet as the focus, and I'm going to run through some of what I consider to be the important parts of site-specific winemaking and what that means to me. So if you get bored, ask for a sheep joke, unmute yourself, and I'll tell you one, and then we'll talk about what that means in terms of winemaking as well. So there'll be a couple of videos of this. I'm going to actually do some hand drawing this time, which was different to last time. So a little bit about what the Alexander Valley looks like. This is Healdsburg, where I am sitting right now. This is my house in Dry Creek. So Healdsburg is a unique situation because we've got Alexander Valley, we've got Russian River, we've got Chalk Hill. Sorry, we've got Dry Creek, Russian River, Chalk Hill, and the Alexander Valley. I always say the Alexander Valley looks like an upside down Y. Basically, this is the Russian River flowing through the Alexander Valley. And we have two parts. We have this part of the Alexander Valley and this part of the Alexander Valley. So it is a Y, but it's a very small Y. Most of what we work on are vineyards in this area, which are little knolls, and then anything facing east, because the major piece for me is making sure that we have morning sun and not afternoon sun. The vineyard that we'll talk about next week is this new vineyard that we purchased here, and this eventually, when it's fully replanted, will become the main base for Katherine. Fidelity, which is a vineyard that we own north of, just right in the town of Geyserville, really. Forefathers comes from further up the valley. The Chelsea Merlot vineyard is out here, where we've got a little bit more fertility because Merlot needs a deeper soil. And then, of course, Yoeman and Katherine come from further down. A look at the Katherine vineyard is, this is on the corner of Geysers Road and 128. And it was originally 2 vineyards, now it's 5. So we purchased grapes from all 5. And the valley continues down here, but sitting right above that is the Yoeman vineyard. So looking at Cabernet, the key features for me are mass selections, which we don't use a lot of clonal material. You can always tell if it's a clone because you've got a big cluster with big berries and bigger tons. The age of the vineyard for me is, I think that we really need the vines to be 7 years old before I can even start really truly assessing the quality. And then, of course, anything older than 20 years for me, it's the beginning of the prime. When I worked for large corporations, the depreciation was 30 years. So we needed to get the vineyards to 30 years. So most of the vineyards that I am working on were planted in the 80s. There's not too many vineyards that I work on that are older than that, except for Zinfandel. As I said, I want east facing, and on that, the Piedmont, or the middle piece of the slope, is what I'm interested in. The top of the hills the soils are too thin. I love working with VSP, vertical shoot positioning, and there's a verb in positioning, a VSP. It's called positioning, and a lot of people don't do that. Too many vineyards are like this, and they're not like that. If you position the shoots directly, then you get much more even light penetration. You can do less management during the season, and I find that more interesting. I showed a chart last time of the average alcohols in Napa Valley and how they've increased over the last 20 years quite dramatically. And for those who didn't see last week's presentation, you can contact me, but it is on YouTube. If you want to go there, it's a link. It says it's 1 hour, but there's a lot of questions and back and forth, so you can skip through some of it. Cane pruning is key for me. I'm going to talk about that. And as a result, we have less handwork during the season, more handwork at this time of the year in terms of pruning. In the winery, we don't make any additions. We basically just destem, and I'll talk more about skin contact, etc., as we go through. So a little bit about mass selections. So I think there's been an evolution. So pre-prohibition, I just made this up yesterday, so this is close to factual. So pre-prohibition, we sort of had random plantings and random varietals planted in the same vineyard. A lot of it was led by Zinfandel. When the Italians came over, they just planted like they traditionally planted. Zinfandel, Mourvedre, Carignan, Petit Syrah, all planted in the same vineyard, and that's what field blends around. Around about 33, which was, obviously that was the end of prohibition, we started to have people replant vineyards, and they were planting according to varietal. And so that's really when it started. In 1960, these varietally labeled wines started to sort of make their mark. And then people started going into the vineyards and identifying plants that were better than others. And so cuttings were made from those plants, and that's what we call mass selections or field selections. So they'd go into the vineyard, they'd find all the best Zinfandel, and they'd just take the cuttings from those, and they'd put them on the AXR1, which of course we thought was resistant to phylloxera, and that's how vineyards were planted. And we had names for these things, and it's especially true with Chardonnay. I'm going to do a seminar in 2 weeks on Chardonnay, and I'll talk more about how important mass selections are to that. And then we had names for each one of those. What's interesting is if you, it was a very interesting one is with Swan. For those who know the wines of Swan, there's the, when Swan Vineyards first planted their Pinot Noir out in the Russian River, it was a collection of Burgundy cuttings that were taking. When Joseph Swan went back to Burgundy, he saw that the yields on a lot of the vines differed, and when he came back to California, he removed a lot of the low producing vines. And so there's the pre-Burgundy trip clones of mass selections that were taken of Joseph Swan, and the ones that he did after. So that was a really big revelation for me in terms of how people look at clones and yields. And of course, we want to have lower yields naturally. We don't really want to be removing crop, and so we really look at the yield as well. And then starting in '88, we had the second generation of phylloxera, and so anything that was planted from '89, '90, when a lot of the plantings were redone, they're all on the new rootstocks, and of course we use clones at that point. So these days, most vineyards are planted to clones, and for me, clones are very similar in their makeup. They're fairly boring in terms of what we can do, but because when we moved from mass selections to clones, the one thing that we did was we removed a little bit of virus that was actually in the plant itself, and it was the virus that was giving us the differences, and we didn't know that. So these days we have the clones that we use for Cabernet are 412, 669, 337, 338, but for me primarily I'm still planting clone 7, which is a UC Davis clone, and it's a selection from what was called Turkey Hill. Turkey Hill was the most interesting mass selection. That was the original Turkey Hill vineyard still exists. It's on the corner of 128 as you head over into Napa Valley and Alexander Valley, and the other option is you go down into Santa Rosa. So there's a really, really old vineyard there. It's about 2 acres, and that's the original Turkey Hill, and people still go out there and take cuttings from it. It's a very clean vineyard, beautiful, beautiful, long, open clusters, and we'll see a couple of those as we go through this. So the mass selections were basically pre-'89. They're all planted on AXR1 or St. George if it was the Zinfandel. Smaller berries, smaller yields, looser cluster, smaller cluster, thicker skin. And if you think, I always have these thought processes about why is it that people do this? There's always a reason for history. And if you think back to traditional California winemaking, it was bring the grapes in, destem it, and extract the hell out of it. You know, 80, 90 degrees, pump it over 200% of the tank every day, blah, blah, blah. Well, the reason why they did that was because they had these thick skins. The berries were much smaller, thicker skins, and so you could extract the hell out of it. Unfortunately, today, people still do that same winemaking, and yet they're using clones, and the clones have thinner skins, bigger berries, and that's why so many California Cabernets these days have dry tannins. They're over-extracted. And I've learned a lot I hate to say it, I've learned a lot in Chile, because in Chile, they moved to clones a lot earlier than what we did in California. And we certainly in Chile and Australia, we do way, way less extraction than what we do in California. So I've incorporated a lot of that winemaking process into what I do in California. It's always good to have a third world country to experiment on like Australia. Post '89, of course, we started using the clones, bigger berry, larger yields, tighter clusters, longer cluster. We had to do more work dropping crop because they were selected for the yields, and it gathers sugar a lot quicker. So the curve for ripening is much quicker. These are the perfect things to plant if you're a grower. Big yield, early sugar. Anyway, that's what you do. Thinner skins and drier tannins.
G'day, Nick Goldschmidt here. I'm standing out here in one of our vineyards, and I thought that I'd just show you the difference between a split, horizontal split, and what we look for in our new vineyards, which is VSP, or vertical shoot positioning. We're moving more and more away from this sort of architecture because we have to make bigger cuts, and this is what we used to call spur pruning, or we call spur pruning, and with big cuts we get more eutypa. On this side, we're moving more to this as we get global warming. This makes it more interesting for us. I only make smaller cuts, I don't get so much disease. I can prune a little bit later, so we've got the sap running, and then the buds push a little bit later in the season. So it's delaying maturity, and that's what we have to do as we go into global warming. Anyway, I'm going to do a quick couple of videos on comparing pruning of these two types. Stay tuned.
So pruning, cane pruning, spur pruning is really key for me. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the clones as I just did, and then how we prune. So this next video is about spur pruning, and then we'll do cane pruning.
Nick Goldschmidt here. I'm here to discuss the difference in spur pruning and cane pruning. And this is an example of spur pruning. This is the spur that was left last year. It's a 2-bud spur. We had 2 shoots coming out of that. And this is what we call a water shoot or an on-count shoot. So I'm actually going to take this one off this year. And I'm going to take the spur off, and I'm going to come back to 2 positions. So that's the way we prune a spur position vineyard.
And you can see how fast that was. Very low IQ necessary.
G'day, Nick Goldschmidt here. I'm here to talk about cane pruning. This is the way we prune these days. This is much more tricky than spur pruning. It takes a little bit more intelligence. So what we do is we take off from fruit from last year. I'm looking for 2 canes to lay down. So I'm taking off some of the canes that we don't want for this year. I've got 2 that are identified. I leave a 2-bud spur position as a replacement spur in case I run into problems next year. So these will be the 2 canes that I lay down for the season. As you can see, it takes a little longer to pull all the wood out, and you have to have a fairly good IQ and understanding what the architecture of a vineyard is going to look like. I will be laying these 2 canes down for the vintage.
So you can see I still leave a 2-bud spur. I leave 2 2-bud spurs because I'm going to lay 3 to 4 canes down on that particular vine, and those 2-bud spurs are the replacement spurs for next year.
So the funny thing about terraced vineyards is that you end up with all these end rows in the middle of the vineyard. So it's pretty funny. So that's just the end row in a vineyard. So I'm here in Yoeman. So what makes Yoeman unique? Well, firstly, we've got this amazing loamy soil. Just beautiful, great water holding capacity. Secondly, the age of the vine. These vines are close to 40 years old. Thirdly, and if I could find a decent spot, it's an old field selection. So what you can see is the berries themselves are individuals, and they ripen fairly evenly, and the berries are extremely small, so we get great skin to pulp ratio. Thirdly, it's cane pruned, so it's on 1-year-old wood that is laid down. You can see that this is last year's wood and this is this year's wood, and obviously that's where we get the fruit for this year. And then we just have really good leaf turgor. There's no crispiness there yet. I can still feel the leaf is fairly cool. So that's 4th. And then 5th is the aspect. Not only is it a terrace, but it's a east to southeast facing slope. So just beautiful combination of all these things, and that's what goes in to make the Yoeman Cabernet Sauvignon from the Alexander Valley so special and unique.
It's pretty funny when I show that video, because the leaf sounds crispy, but it wasn't, I assure you. But I wanted to show you that vineyard in particular. That's what makes Yoeman so unique, is because everything that I believe in is in that vineyard. And these vineyards are so rare to find. It's so rare to find a vineyard that was planted pre-1990 on a non-AXR1 rootstock with a mass selection. That mass selection is not Turkey Hill. It's a combination. We have 2. One, we call it C, S-E-E, like we do with Chardonnay. You've heard me talk about Chardonnay C, but it's a combination of 2 mass selections, one called Jackson, one called Jenkins. But grouped up, we call it the C. This is one of the vineyards that I want to focus on now about site-specific winemaking. This is a particular vineyard block in the valley that we use for Katherine. You can see this piece of the vineyard has a lot more green leaf area, so it's more vigorous. This piece here is medium vigor, and this piece here has low vigor. And so when I'm going to quickly, because in the use of time, this is where we make the dense wines, which I'll talk about. This is where we make the powerful wines, and this is where we make the elegant wines. The yield here is very low. We produce a lot of canopy, but not a lot of crop. Here, the yield is higher, but the canopy is smaller. So it actually takes more work during the season to bring this into the quality level that I need. But the tricky thing was making wine from here, because I did not understand when I was an early winemaker, but you'll see it as we go through this. This is a drone shot you can see of the particular block that we're talking about as we fly over. So you can see we're on the Piedmont, we're in the mid area of the hill. This is a vineyard that was planted in 1990. So it's on resistant stock, but it is planted to the Turkey Hill selection. So it is a mass selection. It's one of my most interesting pieces that we use in the Katherine blend. I won't go all the way here, but you can see definitely the difference between the vigor in the vineyard. We're just zooming in on the car that we drove in on. By the way, my daughter wrote that car off. Unfortunately, that's our big black Suburban. So the things that are important to me, this bloom to hang time. So I'm going to come off sharing, and I'm going to talk. You guys all okay? You're not bored? Tom, you slumped over, mate. I can see you. Seth, you're awake? All right, gotcha. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some of the important charts for me in terms of ripening. Yesterday I did this and the whole chart fell over, so hopefully that won't work. And Bish, thanks for your feedback. I'm moving the chart closer, so hopefully you guys can see this. Right, so those of you who have seen me do this before, the first chart that I always do is the same. And that is this ripening chart. Can you guys see that? I think my black pen ran out. Let's see if my big thick black one works. All right, so this is flowering and this is harvest. At this point in time, we get an increase in acidity. This is what we call veraison. At this point, we get an increase in what people call bricks, which I always laugh at because bricks is a metric term and Americans don't understand metric. You know, 20 bricks is 200 grams per liter. What the hell is 2.37753 gallons per cup? What the hell? No wonder you guys lost that bloody, when you guys, the British and Americans got together and sent that satellite out to Mars and it disappeared from 100 feet from the surface. Those guys in Texas, especially Scott, he was at that discussion. That's why we made that wine called Yardstick. You guys know that wine Yardstick we make from Napa Valley? It's another whole story, but the yard is an old point of reference, and that's long story. The British called the Americans up and said, I thought you said left-hand thread. The Americans said, I thought you're talking metric. It was only a $1.8 billion crater that's now in Mars full of a bunch of junk. Anyway, long story. Bricks, metric. Here we start with flavor. We increase as we get closer to harvest. And then tannins move from green, dusty, dry, ripe. And where these three things meet in Bordeaux is 100 days. Does that make sense? Never happens. If this happened, you wouldn't need clowns like me being winemakers. So they should never let winemakers into the vineyard. That was the first mistake that viticulturalists made. So what happens is, what we need to look at is, if we want to make a wine at 13 alcohol, it's not just a matter of picking the grapes at 21 bricks to make 13 alcohol. Because can you imagine if you picked here, when we hit 21 bricks, say, the flavor and the tannin are not right. So on your tongue, alcohol sits here, but because the fruit and the tannin are not right, the wine finishes short and will taste alcoholic at 13. So the key thing is, if you want to make wine at 13 alcohol, you've got to correctly vineyard manage to bring the flavor and the tannin into balance earlier. And then, of course, if you're in Napa Valley and you allow the grapes to go to 26 bricks, And so on your tongue, alcohol becomes so dominant, again, the wine finish is short and also tastes alcoholic. So we as winemakers and viticulturists, this is where the viticulturists have to come in, because we have to figure out what's going to make sense and where the balance is. Now, scrub all that for a minute. In Bordeaux, in California, sorry, we never get to 100 days. Our baseline is about 125 days because we have much more beautiful weather than they get in Bordeaux. But, you know, every year is a vintage year in Bordeaux, even if you pick on the 99th day because it bloody rained. But it's still a great vintage, don't get me wrong. Anyway, so 125 days to about 145 days, which we'll talk about. So if we were to take a view of a vineyard, like that vineyard I just showed you, and this is why in the New World we grow grapes in earthquake zones. That's why New Zealand is interesting. That's why California and Chile and Argentina are interesting. I don't know what Australia is. It's a big flat pancake with no earthquakes. But anyway, the rest of us are getting on fine. So you have your rows like this. And let's say we have these swale areas, you know, this big vigorous area that I was talking about with lots of leaves, and that's where we make the dense wines. And then the elegant wines are where the vines are a little bit shorter and we have higher crop. And so when I walked into the vineyard, I'm looking for this stuff. Why do I look for this? Well, this is where the definition of site-specific winemaking comes about. This is how we make complex wines using one vineyard. We don't have to, if you have a great vineyard, you do not need to blend across vineyards to get complexity. What we do with Katherine, of course, is we blend in the valley. So it's all one big valley. As I said, it used to be owned by 2 people, now owned by 5 people. Basically, it's the same. Originally, it was one big old vineyard. And so blending across that vineyard makes it really interesting. It's the same thing that we do for Yoeman, a little bit similar to what we do with Forefathers, because it's a really, really small blend Forefathers, so we don't have much chance to play. I only have 2 wines. So let's go back for a second. Let's go back to the year is 1990. I just got the job at CME as winemaker to make Cabernet. I walk into the room, I got 200 Cabernets in front of me, and I have to make CME Reserve Cabernet. When was the last time you guys drank a really, really good bottle of New Zealand Cabernet? That would be like never. Cabernet in New Zealand is produced in Australia. We don't make good Cabernet, and yet I still got the job at CME. So it took me 3 months to make the blend. The 1990 Reserve Cabernet, if you ever get a bottle, it took me 3 months to make that blend. Zalma Long, who was my mentor and my boss at CME, she was the president of CME at the time, she said, would you like to work with a consultant? So I was lucky enough to work with Michel Roland for 12 years. He taught me 2 things. He taught me how to be a consultant, which obviously is what I do now. And he also taught me how to blend. And he said, Nick, there's only 5 sorts of wines that are important, but there's only 3 of them that are key. And the way he would describe them is, on your tongue, there's 3 sorts of wines. There's the elegant wines, which provide the soft berry fruit right up on front of the tongue. The powerful wines, which provide the flesh and the richness. And the dense wines, which provide the structure and the finish. And this is my definition of complexity. So when you go back to the vineyard, when we walk through here, when I started, you know, you'll see me right at the end I'm going to make a blend right at the end. When I started walking into these vineyards, I'm like, dude, this dense wine, I go in there and I'm like, I'm dusty, I'm dry, I'm a raisin. It never got to ripe. It went straight from dry tannins to raisin in one shot. And this is where it was very hard for me to learn, because being an engineer, I wanted to figure this out. So I came up with this chart a couple of months ago, which hopefully you guys can follow. I know it looks tricky, but I'll explain it. So when I walked into the Elegant Vineyard, the tannins, the flavor was much higher in concentration than the tannin. When I was in the powerful vineyard, the fruit and the tannin were about the same balance. And in a dense vineyard, the tannin is always higher concentration than the fruit. And this was the hard concept. I don't want a lot of difference between tannin and fruit. So in a dense vineyard, I end up picking it about 125 days because I want to pick it earlier before the tannins completely override the fruit and before I get to a raisin. Because when you raisin something, it dehydrates. And when it dehydrates, all you're concentrating is sugar, acid, and tannin, so the tannins stay dry. So the key on those big canopy vineyards is to pick them a little bit earlier. In a powerful vineyard, we're normally about 135 days. And in the elegant vineyards, we want to have a big separation between fruit and tannin. And so we normally hit 145 days, which is amazing when you compare it to what the people in Bordeaux are defending. So hopefully that makes sense. You guys with me? A few nods.
Mm-hmm.
Seth, Tom, and Tony, you're on my top screen, man, so I have to look at you three clowns. All right. So where is this leading to? It's we want to, because obviously we're talking about wine here. What I like to do, obviously being an engineer again, I like to pigeonhole everything. I want everything. There's no such thing as a straight line or a black box, but this is about as close as I can get to it. So if we talk about increasing amount of tannin, and I'm not talking about tannins. I can have a wine with a small amount of tannin, but if you picked it unripe, it's going to taste tannic. I can have a wine with a hell of a lot of tannin, but it was picked perfectly and will actually taste soft. So don't get confused between the amount of tannin and the ripeness of tannin. And then the other term that we talk about, which I just mentioned, is complexity. So increasing complexity. Now, this is not an offense to Pinot, but Pinot basically has a lower amount of tannin. Syrah, Zinfandel, Bordeaux, and then California Bordeaux. And what I'm trying to do with all of our wines is bring them in this direction. I want to make them more forward in the mouth, a little bit more, but maintaining complexity. And the reason why this chart looks distorted is because I'm an engineer, remember? It's three-dimensional. So basically what I'm doing is I'm moving away from the blackberry fruit, sorry, the blackcurrant fruit. Blackcurrants are the worst. I worked on a blackcurrant machine harvester once. Unbelievable. When you get that stuff on your clothes, you throw your clothes away. You can't get that stink out of it. So much juice and so green and herbal. Perfect Napa Valley Cabernet. Don't worry, we have a lot of Napa Cab as well. So black currants, blackberry, black cherry, blah, blah, blah. And so the middle point for me is the blueberry character. And then we go all the way up to strawberry, you know, red cherry, plum, blah, blah, blah. So I want to be in this realm here. I want to get away from the green black currants, which is tricky because Cabernet is a spicy variety. If you don't like spice, the argument is, of course, you drink Merlot because Merlot doesn't have the spice. Cabernet should have some spice because that's part of what it is. So how do we do that? So this is where your a little bit of chemistry comes into play. Sorry, I have to explain this because the big thing, of course, is this polymerization or this pigment or this how do we make wines live for a long time, or how do we make them softer? And you know, when you see old bottles of wine, you typically see that crusty shit here. That crusty shit is polymeric pigment. That's tannin and polyphenols that are unstable and falling out. So site-specific winemaking is part of how we do that. So the basic compound, unfortunately, I just have to describe to you for a minute what a flavanol is. You guys remember what flavanols are? Tony does, he's nodding. Good boy. All right, so the key flavanol in grapes is 3 benzene rings. You guys remember benzene rings, right? They're pretty cool to draw. Okay, the key, element, the key flavanol is an anthocyanin. This is purple, and this is the crux of what wine is. when we ferment something, if this is, if we're in the tank, color does this. And as time goes, and the reason why I keep my wines on skins for a long time is the color builds again and becomes more stable. So this is day 3. Day 3 of a ferment is the period of the most color. This is generally about day 7, and this is generally about 21. So what happens is I pick the grapes, I go to Chile, I come back after a month and press them off. Because by then, based on the amount of work that I'm going to do in the tank, which I'm going to describe in a minute, creates this stability. This thing is purple. If you provide heat, light, air, and time to this compound, it joins onto another one, 2 anthocyanins together, and you guys know this, right? These hydroxyl ions, that's an OH molecule and an OH molecule. Those 2 things make H2O, water. Wow. So you cleave those guys off, you've got a 1 oxygen ion left, and that oxygen ion, heat, light, air, and time, joins another one together, and that becomes a tannin. So this compound is red. Purple, red. Da-da-da-da-da, heat, light, air, and time, polymerization, drops out. Crusty shit. When Kim Jong-un drops a nuclear bomb and you run to the bunker, take the Yoeman. This thing's going to live a little longer than some of the other stuff. I don't like crusty shit. Unless it's the year of your birth, firstborn child, year you got married, some other significant thing in your life, and it's got crusty stuff on it, get rid of it. Anyway, just my opinion. So what do? Well, what happens is we come into the winery, we crush the grapes, we put them in a big tank or a little tank. We have the skins, and then we have the wine. This piece of the tank is the most important piece of the tank because this is where the yeast hang out. There's a lot of partying going on down there, man, because there's a lot of nutrients, energy, heat, and that's why we use pump over, punch down, or pulse air, depending on what variety or what type of extraction you're trying to do. So remember, traditional winemaking is elegant. Elegant winemaking is like what we used to do when we had these old mass selections, which I talked about earlier, and what some people are still doing with the clones. So we have very high temperature. We ferment at 30 Celsius. So if you want to convert, you add 15 and double. We give a lot of oxygen. We give a lot of pump over. And then during maceration, I allow the tank to cool down to 18 Celsius. Now, if I did that for the dense vineyards, the wine would be so dry, so tannic, it would almost be undrinkable. So with a dense vineyard, what I do is I decrease the ferment to 22 Celsius. I give less air, less pump over, and I increase the temperature to 26 because I want to increase the polymerization. I want to speed that up. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Whew. Right, I'm just going to go away from. So that was my. Let's go back to hopefully. There we go. So that explains the 125 to 145 days post-bloom. I did 5 graphs for you. We de-stem. We don't make any additions. We actually don't crush the berries anymore because for mass selections, the berries are so small, we don't need to crush them. As I said, I need to go for at least 3 weeks because I want to make sure that I've got enough time to make sure these wines are stable. I thought it was really funny that the Wine Enthusiast came out with the 40 best winemakers under 40 years old. They're exactly the wines I'm not going to take to the bunker because those guys, girls haven't made wines for at least 10, 15 years on the same vineyard. So I want to be sure when I go to the bunker, I'm going to take a wine that's going to take a while. Actually, we could change it to the coronavirus, I guess. When you're stuck at home, you want to be drinking wines that last a long time. Elegant, powerful, dense winemaking is employed. I also do cold racking, which means I want to, when you chill the tank, not like Chardonnay, like Sauvignon Blanc Chardonnay, where we have to chill for tartrate stability. We don't need to do that with reds. But what I do is I take the temperatures down to about 4 degrees Celsius for reds, and it actually drops the solids. And when you drop the solids, you get an ability for a much cleaner rack. And when you do that, you can avoid Brett. And then we do 3 racks and barrel, and we give a little bit of air too. So I'm constantly trying to think about how we stabilize tannins. Okay, let's see. I just want to.
G'day.
The last thing I'm going to play this. I'm going to play this video.
G'day, Nick Goldschmidt here. I'm sitting here with 3 glasses of wine, and everything we do is single vineyard. And the way we get complexity out of a single vineyard is by choosing blocks and styles, or working the wines to the way the vines best exemplify themselves. So when I was young, I walked into a room once at a pretty well-known winery with 200 wines on the table. I'm wondering, how am I going to blend 200 wines? I came from New Zealand, I didn't know anything about Cabernet. And so working with a consultant, we figured out the best way to do this is to put them into families. Elegant wines, which are the soft berry fruit wines right up on front of the tongue, the powerful wines which provide the fleshiness and the richness, and the dense wines which give us structure and power. So when we go ahead and line all those wines up, I sorted all the elegant wines together, and I chose the best elegant wines and made a blend. I got the best powerful wines and made a blend, the best dense wines and made a blend, and we had 3 wines, all from the same vineyard, all from maybe in the same block or not the same block, but all from the same vineyard. And then we made a blend of these 3 wines, and it was the most complex wine that we could possibly make. So today I continue that process. With elegant wines, we can extract them a little bit more aggressively because we know that the tannins are in a lower concentration than the fruit, so we can extract more tannin. Whereas on a dense wine, if we made wine like that, they become too dry and too tannic, so we lower the extraction and try and make the wines more fruit forward. So if I was to drink an elegant wine, I'm going to get more red cherry, great structure, very forward in the mouth, very, very elegant, very ripe, but good acidity, red fruit, and very forward in the mouth. The powerful wine, I can immediately get it. It's more black cherry, a little bit of walnut, and the mouth is really rich, really full, powerful. Not a lot going on in the front of the mouth, not a lot going on in the structural part of the mouth either. And then the dense wines, much more chocolate, a lot more black cherry, but all finished, very supple tannins, good structure, good acidity. And so when we put the 3 together, hopefully, and it's never 30-30-30, because in a warm vintage, I probably want a little bit more of the dense component, whereas in a cool vintage, I want more of the elegant component. So it really depends on the vintage. And when I put all 3 together, we get the most complex wine we possibly can from the same vineyard. And that's how we make single vineyard wines really complex.
So hopefully that made sense. And then if I was to rank, I just want to, one more chart and then we'll shut it down. But I started doing this a couple of years ago when I was in Texas. So the big thing for me is elegant vintages, powerful vintages, and dense vintages. Shitty vintages. So the interesting thing for me is when we look at these vintages. Sorry, sometimes I can't do this without. I have to think about it. So if we were to look at this on a global scale, this is why I live in California. I mean, I make wine in Chile, Argentina, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, and I've also made wine in Portugal and Spain and Italy. This is unbelievable. I mean, if you were to look at, if you were to outrule the 80s, And I would even question 98. In fact, a lot of people have gone back to suggesting that 98 wasn't even that bad a vintage. I mean, this is unbelievable. This is why California is such a crazy place. I would admit, obviously 2012, there's a few vintages that I pick on that are just amazing. In recent times, 2012, and then we had the drought years, 13, 14, 15, 16 17 we started to come out of the drought. 18 was not a drought year because we had rainfall, but 19 and 20, again, I mean, we've had less than 30% of the rain that we normally get in this particular vintage as well. So anyway, just to wrap up, so I gave you my vintage chart of elegant, power, and shitty. I should change that word. And so what we do is everything. Our Cabernet is our focus. Obviously, most of what we do, we make 4 or 5 wines over in Oakville as well. Everything we do is vineyard, vintage, variety. 1 vineyard, 1 vintage, 1 variety, and of course they're all vegan these days. These vineyards all have real stories, and we really encourage you guys to come out and visit. And please come and visit me in September, October, because, well, I'm here now too, but September, October, I'm always around, and it's easy just to travel with myself or Claudia as we run around the vineyards. Most of these vineyards, well, I've been working in the Alexander Valley since 1990, but the vineyards that we're working with Katherine and Yoeman, I started working with in 1992. The neighbors that we are surrounded with in Katherine and the Yoeman Vineyard are Lancaster, Silver Oak, Robert Young, AVV, and Foray Corona, so pretty good group. Actually, I left Jordan off. Jordan's actually on the south-facing side of the hill, so Jordan is also there. And Katherine, we often put up against Foray Corona, St. Francis, Rodney Strong, and AVV, but it's much more limited release and not as available. So I'm able to do videos. I can do these sort of meetings for any of your teams or retailers, etc. And these are my contacts in case you don't have them. And I really appreciate the time that you've taken to spend a little bit of time with me today. I'm going to stay on. I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to unmute. And if any of you have any questions, or if you want to stick around at the end, please do so. But again, I really thank you for hanging out for me. So have fun out there, man. And hope you enjoy a Cabernet or 2 over the next few days.
6 p.m. Monday through Friday.
Easter.
That was great.
Thanks very much. I'll just jump in the chat room if there's anything there. Oh my God, there's a whole bunch of chats.
To help spread out this large volume.
Sorry, Michael. I hope it was big enough for you. Maybe next time I'll send you for glasses.
File on a certain day.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Really cool.
This is helping to reduce wait time, but not enough. So starting after this holiday.
Thanks, Sean.
Somebody listening to a podcast or something?
Hours to calendars another day of the week.
Well, I am recording this. As I said, I'll send you guys the link.
Also in the process of ramping up the size of our unemployment insurance team.
I'll send you guys the link. It'll be on YouTube.
Over 150
I've got all your contacts because you're
and hiring additional contractual employees. We're in the process of more than doubling our claim center staff.
I know.
This will ensure that we can better serve our customers and reduce the backlog of phone calls.
I'm going to mute everyone. If anyone's got a question.
There you go. I think you're good now.
Yeah.
There we go. I found out who it was. Anyone got any questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Would it
Patricia.
be possible to get a vegan certification on the back label?
You know, as far as I know, in wine, there is no vegan certification. In food, there is. One of the things the big thing right now is sustainability. And New Zealand was the first country to do sustainability. In fact, you'll see on the back label of our Sauvignon Blanc, you'll see the certification.
Okay.
It's about the only thing that's legal right now that we can put on a bottle.
Okay.
I think our wines are all vegan. There's no question about that. But I don't know if there's a symbol that we can use for it.
Okay.
Right. I'm gonna mute everyone again. Somebody else is. Okay, you can unmute yourself if you've got a question. But yeah, Patricia, that's about as good as we can get. We have the vineyard around my house is, so the second country in the world to do sustainability was Chile, but it's a bit loose down there and not everybody's jumped on it. Sonoma County is number 3, and all the vineyards that we work on are registered sustainable, and by 2021 we think 95% of all the vineyards in Sonoma County will be registered sustainable. Napa Valley has not done that yet. But as you drive around Sonoma County, you can see the sustainability symbol. In fact, if you drive in our driveway, you can see it. We do work on a couple of organic vineyards as well. You can, if you go to my YouTube channel, you can see some of the organic vineyards we work on. One of the big ones is one of the ones that we work over in Oakville. But the vineyard around our house, we're gradually moving into as well. The big thing for me is herbicides. And you guys have all seen the recent press about Roundup and systemic herbicides that are, this is Nick Goldschmidt's opinion. I just think that those systemic herbicides are really, really bad. I mean, some countries are still using methyl bromide, which is something that you used to see in the Central Valley. Is not widely used anymore, especially in the plantation of strawberries. So to grow a strawberry is very sensitive to nematodes. So using methyl bromide, basically you can sterilize soil about a foot down, knocks all the nematodes out, and that's how you grow strawberries. Very bad for the environment. And some countries are still allowing that. In California, we basically outlawed that. And soon, obviously, we're going to be moving away from Roundup and other systemics. But I really notice when I walk into sustainable vineyards with lower use of herbicides, the amount of insects is just incredible. You have a couple of years that are tough and you really regret doing it, but then you gradually build up this natural balance. And one of the things that we're doing, obviously I learned this in New Zealand, is making sure that we have permanent cover between our rows. And when you have permanent cover, you actually allow more home for the insect. When you drive around vineyards, and I noticed this when I was working in the Barossa, as soon as it rained in the Barossa, everyone would run out with their discs and disc everything to try and get the water to penetrate. Well, guess what? You don't need to do that. If you have permanent cover, the weeds are allowing the water to penetrate into the ground quickly anyway, so you don't need to do that. So working more with just allowing the grasses to dry off in the summer and moving away from herbicides and moving more to mechanical weed removal. We can do this and we do it. The problem is in rocky vineyards. In rocky vineyards, it's very, very hard to use mechanical weeders. But the technology is starting to show up now that we'll be able to use that with stony vineyards as well. Hope that answers your question about vegan.
Nick, can you talk about the issue of smoke taint with California wines?
Yeah, so smoke taint, unfortunately, I've learned about smoke from non-California wines. So the first incidents we had was 2008 in California, Knights Valley, if you guys remember back that far. Knights Valley went on fire right next to harvest. It was a very limited fire, but it was the first time that we started thinking about it. Subsequently in Chile in 8, 9, and 11, we had fires. In the Okanagan Valley in Chile, we had 2 years in a row and then a third year, and then we had the one up in Lake County. So as we have global warming or global uncertainty or whatever you want to call it, we are going to be faced with more and more fires. There's one key thing that is very, very hard to explain, and that is that if you have a fire at the end of the vintage or during the vintage like we did in 2018, what am I talking about? 2018, we had a fire right at the end of, right in the last 15% of the vintage. If you have fire then, no problem. The only problem you get is if the ash falls on the cluster. If the ash falls on the cluster, yes, you're going to get smoke taint. The real problem is if you have fires during veraison. It's quite complicated to explain, but during veraison, the vines are pushing and the leaves are highly photosynthetic. When these leaves are photosynthetic, they're transpiring a lot. They're absorbing a lot what's in the atmosphere. And this is why you don't want to plant grapes next to eucalyptus, garlic, or onions, because the oil that comes off those plants get into the leaf and are absorbed into the grape. So if you have a fire at the point of veraison or quickly thereafter, like 3 weeks, right around that 3-week period, if you get a fire then, you got a problem. But if you have a fire at harvest, the leaves are no longer photosynthetic. They're already fallen, they've collapsed, they're not transpiring very much. And you saw me touch that leaf in the Yoeman Vineyard. That leaf is not transpiring, because if you look below it, you would have seen some of the senescing that was going on. So if you get a fire at that point, not a problem. We do have the technology these days to remove smoke taint. And I find it, the best way to describe it for me is a menthol cigarette. You know, when you're a kid, because it doesn't smell smoky, it doesn't taste smoky, but it tastes menthol. I get the strong menthol character. So I find it, you can't argue with customers, but, oh, you know, it's a 2018, it's got smoke. No, it doesn't, unless you understand the chemistry. And it's the way we measure it is Flavanol or 4-guaiacol, which is the way we measure Brettanomyces. And half these people can't even identify Brettanomyces. So what makes them think they can identify smoke? If you're worried about smoke, the most important thing is to ask, when did you get the fire? Unfortunately, there's a county just north of Napa that you may have heard of that had a fire right at the wrong time. So wines that were grown up in that county in 2018 and 2016 do have smoke taint. It's funny, one day I was in Canada, and you know how you're sitting at a big table with a whole bunch of winemakers and people, and you're having a good time and you're drinking wine, and someone fills your glass up and you grab it and you go, I had a really embarrassing situation. I got this glass in front of me and I drank. I'm like, shit, what the hell was that? And I'm like, dude, this wine's got smoke taint. I don't know who was pouring it. Well, the winemaker was sitting like 3 people down on the other side of the table. The guy could not smell smoke taint. So some people are sensitive to it and some people are not. So that also, and then, you know, the other way to, you know, we can use reverse osmosis to get rid of it, or blending it away. But blending is it's very hard to blend it away. So using RO is really the only way to get rid of it. Hopefully that answers your question.
It did, thank you.
Anything else, guys? Oh, I got more chats.
Nick, thanks so much. I'm gonna head out. Great time.
Yeah, no, really appreciate your time, and next week just blast it around to as many people as you want. And as I said, next week we'll discuss how to plant a vineyard, which is I'll have to put a bit of work. I'll have to put a bit of work into it, Joe. To
take care.
It'll be a good exercise. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for joining, man.
Thank you for doing this. These are awesome.
No problem. All right, guys, I will, I'll download this. I'll post it on YouTube and send it out to you, but really appreciate you guys joining, and love you all. So stay tight, stay thirsty, stay low, and we'll get through this. Salute. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
And no comments on my shirt this week.
It's awesome.